Hi everyone. Hi Laura and Rick. So happy to be chatting to you today. Um, the way in which we got in touch with Rick, very interesting because we have been obviously looking at trauma in the workplace, Laura and I, and we came across this book. And this book was about trauma in the workplace, and we were just amazed that there had been so much literature written about this topic already. So we had to get in touch with Rick and ask him about it, and that has been perfect because Rick has really good practical application of actually how to assist individuals and assist organizations in terms of trauma. So just by way of introduction, I'm going to list items around what Rick has gone through, and then we'll probably be elaborating on that through the conversation. So Rick initially trained as a counselor in the mid-1990s, initially in Georgia, USA, and then at Strathclyde University. And he co-edited his first book there, Experiences of Person-Centred Counselling Training. After that, he was awarded an honorary research fellowship for his MPhil on emotional intelligence in the workplace, which is obviously a huge topic. Rick then founded Edinburgh Coaching and Counselling. He headed up Person-Centred Therapy. He became the Northern UK counsellor for a global pharmaceutical company. Very interestingly, he was led to the UK's largest employee assistance program provider, and he specialised as a clinical case manager for most of the UK rail operators, concentrating on trauma support. And this is where I find it fascinating because it does deal with trauma in the workplace on a big scale. So at ICAS, as well as privately, Rick provided post-trauma support after 9/11, the London bombings, and the Asian Tsunami. So after that, 2002, Rick became deputy chair of the Association for Counselling at Work, and he also joined the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy in 2008 as their lead advisor. So we know Rick has written a lot of books. He's a frequent contributor to the national media, trade and business press, and he's a registered member of BACP. So with all of that, I mean, that's a super duper experience and bio. I'd love to get your view on your whole career and maybe the passion points behind it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Patricia, and hello, Laura, as well. Great to be with you. Thanks for the invite. Yes, I've had an interesting sort of trajectory of a sort of career, I suppose. And initially, I started out with a business degree, which you'll wonder what on earth is that about. Well, when I left school, I wasn't quite sure what to do, and I thought a business degree would be quite useful. And then I started off with a short career in advertising. I love the creativity in advertising, but fairly quickly after that, I realized I needed something that was much more people-focused, much more about the depth of individuals rather than people as consumers or commodities. So I made that shift. I started from scratch again, and as you mentioned, that's when I retrained as a counsellor. And so I suppose when I started out, I was looking for a kind of a pathway. Where is my specialism? Where is my interest? And I had experience as a counsellor in primary care and private practice with a number of different employee assistance program providers. But I think after that, it was the workplace which I found of most interest because there was such a diversity of people, diversity of organizations that existed. And so I think my interest in trauma was because of the fact that I realized that kind of trauma is all around us, and it's sad, but that is the reality of life. And I'll come on to one of the books later that kind of focuses on that. But trauma, as we know, can be defined in very different ways. With employee assistance programs, a lot of it is about the critical incidents that exist, and it's how organizations prepare themselves as organizations, but also their people to react to, respond to, and recover from difficult traumatic experiences. So a lot of these have been big scale events, but also smaller scale events like suicides in the workplace, sudden death as well. They can have dramatic impacts on teams. And I think the nature of trauma is that we tend not to expect them. These are abnormal events. So we react to them in ways that we're not used to. And when I work with individuals, a lot of the time would be about normalizing a kind of normal response to an abnormal event. And that's how we normalize the kind of trauma reactions that a lot of people go through. So whether it's from an organizational perspective, and that's looking after the wider collective of the organization, or the individual or the teams, it's still about looking at how do people respond to these situations. So yes, I've sort of moved from working within the core psychological trauma, and again, I'll briefly come on to some of the books that connect with that. And that's kind of moved into the area that I know you have an interest in, which is the kind of corporate trauma, which looks at issues which are not necessarily about critical incidents or terrorist events or death and fatalities. But it's about some of the corporate structures that can create a traumatic experience. So trauma by its nature is something people don't expect. So we all expect to be treated well at work. The organizations have a duty of care, as we know. But sometimes things happen. We operate in businesses where we have a huge variety of people who exist. We have to come together and work. It is a bit like a family. We have to somehow get on, and sometimes we don't get on. So there can be toxic work environments, there can be poor managing, there can be bullying and harassment. So a range of different situations that emerge just because of the kind of microcosm of people who are involved in the organization. But I've also seen that there's been a lot of research into bullying and harassment, how that can potentially trigger post-traumatic stress disorder. So it is that drip, drip, drip effect, which often happens with bullying and harassment. And people can be quite traumatized. They're trapped, they're isolated, they don't know where to go, they're fearful of their job, and they're lost and they're locked in that situation. So I suppose I've shifted more from the corporate side of things to working more with individuals. And the way that I trained as a therapist, it was very much from a humanistic, holistic perspective, and rather coming in with a range of strategies and techniques, although sometimes I do use strategies and techniques, it's very much about trying to understand the individual. And the issue of trauma, again, is about how we coped with trauma in the past, how resilient we are, but also in the moment, what's going on in our world. It might be that we react to a trauma situation, whether it's a critical incident or some sort of toxicity element in the workplace, that we react more differently, I suppose, because maybe we've got an issue going on at home, which means that our groundedness at home is not providing the stability that would otherwise help us develop the resilience to deal with the difficult situation. Or there may be a range of different life stages that we're at, which determines what happened. A trauma that we experience maybe early on in our career may feel more threatening because we're not used to that, but also because our jobs and our career ladder is perhaps more important than when we get into our 50s and 60s. So every time we go through a life stage event, we're kind of starting afresh in terms of our capacity for well-being, for stress management, and for resilience as well. So each stage of our life will create a different environment for us to deal with things in different ways. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of an overview as to the route that I've come, but I can also talk about some of the books, and that'll give you an idea of the trajectory too.
Yeah, I think that would be great to hear. And I didn't say at the beginning that we're just very happy to have you on here as well. And just hearing some of the experience you've had, I'm looking forward to getting into it. Yeah, speak to the books, and then we can see where that takes us. Okay,
the first one that co-edited. So I co-edited, it's called Employee Wellbeing Support, a Workplace Resource. I co-edited with a chap called Andrew Kinder and also Professor Sakari Cooper. And what we were looking at that is how organizations collectively support employees in organizations. So there are different ways that support can be offered, either through employee assistance program, but also internally in terms of positive management, culture, leadership as well, mediation if it's needed, mentoring, coaching, other forms of counselling. So there's a lot of support that can be offered to employees. And we canvass around the world to get a perspective of what different countries are doing in the wider field of employee support. So that was, I think, back in 2008. Seems a long time ago now. But the three of us also had an interest in trauma. And so in 2012, I think it was, we wrote the International Handbook of Workplace Trauma Support. So I led on editing that. And again, that was fascinating, really trying to identify people who could contribute for the book. And we wanted a global perspective on how different cultures deal with trauma. And this could be involving multinationals who are based in the UK, but who have outlets in, say, India. So how would the Indian culture deal with the UK-based culture of an organisation? So we had contributors from all around the world, as I say, India, I think we had Africa, most European countries, Northern America, and we also had a fascinating one from China as well, looking at how they deal with trauma. And I think that book kind of highlighted to us that trauma can mean very different things, very different cultures. And in that case, we need to understand how we respond with that cross-cultural understanding and perspective so that we respect the cultures that exist there. So in a sense, these have been books where we wanted to share our insight, but I think it's just because we've been fascinated by the subject. So that was the kind of the trauma side of it. And then we made a slight deviation into the crisis book, Overcoming and Surviving Work-Life Crises. And that was because we realized that, okay, trauma does happen, but actually there's something about resilience in all of this. And the crisis book really was to highlight that whether we like it or not, we are likely to go through a number of crisis situations in our lives, professionally at work, but also personally. One of my crises that I had to deal with, which I certainly didn't expect, was my late father was a minister of religion, and he was going to marry my wife and I. And while he hadn't been very well with various cancers, what we didn't expect and what happened was he died of a stroke the day before he was going to marry us. Now, we couldn't have anticipated that would happen, although because he was ill, it kind of mitigated the fact that we half assumed that there was a risk in what he was doing. It was still a traumatic situation for us both, but it's something that we've had to work through, and that was a crisis example for us that we had to deal with. But the crisis book highlights 60 different potential life crises that we identified could affect any of us during our life, which sounds quite depressing. But then if you think that most of us are going to live into our 80s, that's, there you go. And
I like it. So there's an idea there that if you prepare for a crisis in a way that it's not so unexpected, you're building a little bit of resilience to the crisis when it is likely to happen.
Yes, and I think that's true. I think it's understanding the big picture, and it might seem strange to say this, but getting over my father's death and my own grief process was, I think, helped because he had a recent diagnosis for oh gosh, can't remember. It was some aggressive cancer, and we knew that the prognosis was going to be actually a very painful ending for him. So the fact that he died very quickly from a stroke, and that was relatively painless as far as we could understand from the medical team who supported him after during his death, actually helped us cope better because he didn't have to go through the painful ending that we were all expecting. So in a sense, weirdly, that mitigated our sense of loss, that we were able to accept and work with it in a much better way. So yeah, I think you're right. If we can anticipate that difficult things could happen, and when I worked with the rail operators with ICAS, one of the areas we were looking at was, is it possible to develop a sort of a stress inoculation or a trauma inoculation to prepare ourselves? And we were doing some work where we were highlighting to various teams in various rail networks that actually, because of the industry that you're in, there's a much greater likelihood of trauma than perhaps in some other organizations. So we can tell you that there will be suicides on the line, there will be assaults, there will be robberies, there will be violence. It's not to say that any of this is acceptable, but it's the facts of where we are in that particular organization. And clearly other emergency services will have other trauma-related things that they will be encountering in their world. But trauma inoculation is about highlighting, okay, if this happens, these are the likely reactions you might experience. So that, again, it's in advance normalizing the trauma responses. And we did hear at the time that that was useful for people who said, yes, I remember that workshop. And the fact that I am having flashbacks, the fact that I'm not sleeping, the fact that I'm quite irritable, these are my normal reactions to an abnormal event. So I think there is some sort of preparation that can help. But ultimately, I think life experience is going to be the best support for resilience.
There's so many different threads we could pull in this, and I think there'll be many conversations had in the future, Rick. I think, well, there's many questions I'd love to ask. I'm going to come back to corporate trauma because I have a little voice inside my head saying that's why we're here. It sounds a bit like Patricia. So you talk about crises, you talk about events, and you talked a little bit about, you know, longer term sort of the kind of incremental, maybe death by 1,000 paper cut type trauma that can be bullying and harassment. But as you've gone into the workplace, what have been some of the different manifestations or examples of trauma that you've seen? And are you starting to work, you know, take your work from individuals to organizations, and what can organizations do, similar to what you're talking about with your work with the rail, as opposed to what can individuals do to prepare? Is there work that organizations can do as well to mitigate trauma?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, having sort of predominantly worked with individuals, but then moved into the corporate side, and sometimes back to individuals, because obviously with individuals, you're working with the uniqueness of somebody's whole life experience. And what I'm finding more in organizations, that where you may have similar organizations in a particular sector, every organization has a very unique culture. And it's through that uniqueness that is ripe for exploring where the problems are occurring, but also more importantly, what the solutions might be. So a huge amount obviously depends on the leadership. How do they manage their organization? How do they treat their staff? What is the reputation that leader has of staff? But also there's going to be the trickle-down effect that the leader will determine the ultimate focus for the organization. But what is the senior management team like? What is the board of directors like? What are the middle managers like? And importantly, what's the communication flow that goes all the way through there as well? Patricia, I saw you potentially coming in there. Were you going to ask something?
No, I'm not. Well, I mean, I love the fact that you're explaining that it's makes it more pragmatic or practical, because I think there's just from my perspective, you know, I work inside of organizations doing things like leadership development. So yeah, I would love to get your steer on what Laura asked, which is, what else can organizations do, and also on a very practical level?
Yeah, I think a lot of it can come from the kind of the word of mouth. What's the word on the street? What are people talking about? So that the kind of the undercurrent, which always I think is important to acknowledge, because a lot of people don't voice issues before they become problems. And when problems emerge, then they can become catastrophic for organization. So it's understanding what that sort of, almost like the grapevine or the undercurrent of organizations are. But also I think we need facts as well. And I think audits are really important, whether it's staff satisfaction audit, cultural audits, stress audits. There are lots of different things that can be done just to try and identify where some of the crux points are. I've worked with some organizations where you see certain departments where a stress is identified as being perhaps over in sort of long working hours, whereas another department might be there's a more autocratic manager. Another department might be there's lack of clarity in goals or roles. So it's almost like drawing from the health and safety executive stress standard. That's always a really good template to understand where the potential stresses are likely to emerge. And they will differ between teams, not just departments and subsidiaries as well. So I think it's getting the real detailed intelligence to understand where some of the pinch points are, where the organization is creaking, and you want to address the creaks and plug those holes before the cracks fully occur and the damage is much more difficult to rectify.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, Rick, I love that because I'm very much into diagnostics. My whole doctorate was around that. So, and also knowing that, systemically there might be trauma inside of the system, the industry, our ideas around performance or production, working kind of 9 to midnight, just in that burnout, pushing towards burnout, but also that it's so individualistic. So it feels like treating the individual or developing individual capabilities would be a useful way to do this. And I'm intrigued around how it is that you've worked with individuals around their, developing their own skills.
Yeah, and I think it really does start from the individual. So it's when I worked as a coach or a counsellor with individuals and organisations, it's trying to identify what brings them to me in the first place. So there's some stuckness, there's some problem, and they're wanting change. They're wanting something to change. So you're trying to work out then what is the capacity for the individual to impact that change, but also where is the organizational responsibility to be part of that change. And that's sometimes where you have to sort of negotiate with the two worlds. As a coach and counselor to an individual, I can only work with that individual. But obviously it's possible to encourage them to find a way forward, to find the routes for their solution by going through the organizational structures. So going through mediation if that's necessary, going through their manager, through human resources, or whatever resource is available to them. So in organizations, it's about understanding the individual as a person, but where they fit in with the organization and how that organization works. Where are the get out of jail free cards going to be, and where is their route? And that's going to be different for everyone.
And sorry, I'm just going to jump in here quickly just to ask, have you seen where that doesn't work, the individual bumps up against the system?
Yeah, in quite a number of ways. One is they might feel overly threatened, so they might feel quite isolated. They might have a lack of confidence in themselves, so they might lack the confidence to take a deep breath and ask the question that needs asking. They might not want to upset the boat. They don't want to be the one who jumps forward. And this often happens when you get complaints and disciplinaries within teams. You'll get one person who suddenly makes a complaint, then you'll suddenly see a sea of other ones that come through. So there's something about confidence, something about threat, fear of their jobs. They're worried that if they say something, they might lose their job, or if they don't, how they'll be treated afterwards. So there's a lack of confidence in the system that they can be supported during that process. But also, I think that there's that kind of internal crisis of why me? Why is it that I've been labelled, or why is it that I'm the one that's affected and maybe other people are not? So yeah, I think there are a lot of internal issues, but it's also trying to help them navigate and develop the wherewithal and the capacity to engage with the organisation. And when I've gone into organisations, it's kind of working the other way. It's helping them identify how can we become a more engaging organisation? How can we develop our culture so our managers have greater empathy and actually understand how to treat people as people? And rather seeing themselves as managers, it's to see them as facilitators. I think the word manager is off-putting because it's a very autocratic term in its sense. You manage, you're in charge. But I think a facilitator is much freeing because it means that you're much more equal with other people. It's one of the things I've actually found during the pandemic when you have team meetings. And what's been really interesting is rather than having the manager or the boss at the end of the table in the office back in the old days, the manager has a little piece of screen. They're equal. They have the same real estate space as the rest of the team. So there's something about that marries up the equality that has existed during the pandemic, and it's one of the potential beneficiaries that has emerged through that. So I wandered a wee bit off, but I hope that's given you a sense.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'll comment here really quickly, because what you brought up is so important for me, and what I like to keep reinforcing is that there is individual accountability in building resilience and having a positive mindset, a growth mindset, and taking care of yourself and your own resiliency levels so that you can anticipate and move through challenges that are natural as part of a working culture. And there is a very important role of the organization as well in creating a psychologically safe and inclusive and supportive environment where people who go through that work are met. They're met and they're supported and they're able to recover from these challenges when they happen. So I'm so glad you said that, because we're not here just to put all of the burden on the individual, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I've been doing a bit of research between the two of you and the work that you've been doing, I see that you've met with Peter Kelly from the Health and Safety Executive in the past, and you've engaged with him in, I think, one of your articles. And Peter from the Health and Safety Executive is obviously very focused on what organisations can do to provide that conducive working environment and meet that duty of care responsibility. And I think through his work and the work of many other organisations, it's also identifying that we're not trying to be difficult to organisations. It's about helping them realise this makes good business sense. If you have a happy, capable, able, supported and protected workforce, they're going to deliver a lot more, and their engagement with the organisation's customers is going to be much more real as well. So this is all a big win-win for organizations.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would love to know, where are we now? What's happening with trauma and the pandemic? You touched on it a little bit, but yeah, what do we do now?
Yeah, good question.
Collective and unexpected mass trauma.
Well, especially when we're hearing about the new variant of COVID and we're thinking, what next? Where do we go from here? But I think there are a number of observations that I've kind of picked up over the last couple of years. And one is the fact that this is a global pandemic. It's not something that really any of us have experienced in the past. So as a society, as a range of countries, we've all had to find a way to work together to work through this. Sometimes that means adhering to the various government restrictions. Sometimes it might be reacting and having a tantrum about having to have yet another lockdown. But ultimately, we're all in this together. And I would classify the pandemic as a traumatic situation. But I think in some ways what's slightly mitigated it is the fact that this is not one individual who's experienced a traumatic situation. As a country, we're all experiencing the same problem, but clearly we'll all be experiencing our individual perspectives to that. So the fact that I remember my team when in the first lockdown, we were doing lots of WhatsApps, which we never did in the past. And we were just checking in with each other. And ironically, I found I was more in touch with my team during the first lockdown than I ever was before. And I thought, this is weird. But it kind of made me realize that we are all in this together. We need to find that way forward. And yet it's not easy. It has been traumatic, and particularly with the people who've lost loved ones, particularly with the people who haven't been able to see loved ones in hospital because of restrictions. There's been a huge amount of pain, heartache and distress out there. But I think from an organizational perspective, we've been forced to change how we work in a way that the pandemic has accelerated. I think we're doing things now in organizations that might have taken 10, 15 years to develop and emerge. And I wouldn't wish that the pandemic ever happened again, but I suppose it's with trauma and resilience, sometimes it's about trying to identify the nuggets of gold that emerge from this. I know one of your contributors in the past have talked about post-traumatic growth, and I'm a great believer that there is an opportunity for post-traumatic growth to come out of a number of different critical or traumatic situations. And I think that's what we're experiencing. We are finding the post-traumatic growth. So what would that manifest itself? I found in teams when I've had workshops and meetings with organizations that there's been a lot more of what they call the disinhibition effect. So rather than being the quiet person at the end of the table, not quite sure what to say because all your colleagues are there and your boss is there, people are chipping in to the Teams or the Zoom meetings a lot more easily and more confidently. I think because they maybe feel protected behind the screen, or they may be in their home environment, so they feel safer. But people have become a lot more open and focal. Actually, focal and vocal probably apply. But I've also seen that people are more relaxed and generally open and transparent. So I've seen a lot less suits in various conference calls. People are dressing a bit more casually, but that's normalizing people as people rather than I am who I am because I wear my fancy suit. You're also seeing a bit of people's backgrounds when people have been working from home. So I don't know what on earth you get about me from my background, but obviously I've got a light and I've got a dog. But I can see a bit into your backgrounds, and for me that personalizes my connection with you. And Patricia, you know, I'm intrigued about some of your pictures behind you. So if we were having a formal meeting in the old days, we'd probably all have our laptops up, we'd be checking emails, nobody would be talking, somebody would come in and say, right, let's start the meeting. But in Zoom or Teams, we'd often start now with, Patricia, tell me about that picture to your right ear. I'm fascinated by it. So again, you're getting a bit more personality coming out that wouldn't otherwise happen.
I'll say that, sorry to interrupt. Usually I'm at home and you can see into my you can see into my bookcase, and an as if cross stitch sort of Clueless reference. But also I'm at my mum's house now, so I'm not going to put her house on display.
Well, that's a shame, because I would love to be interrogating you about different books that I can see in your back. I
usually get it. I do get it.
Maybe another time. But the other thing, sorry, Patricia.
No, and they're all color coded.
Next time.
No books.
Sorry,
time. Rick, go ahead.
No, I was going to say in terms of how managers have been changing their style, and this is the element that I think is most important in terms of culturally how we've worked through, from a corporate culture point of view, through the pandemic, and how we've accelerated what I I think so probably nearly 20 years ago when I was doing my research degree on emotional intelligence in the workplace. Emotional intelligence at that time was relatively new. It was a bit of a new kid on the block, but people were still a bit resistant to engaging with it. And I was hoping to do a PhD on that subject. And I had a number of organizations I was working with on the master's side of it, but I wanted to go deeper into the impact of emotions in the workplace. And no organization would help me at that time because they thought, oh, we're going to open up a can of worms here if we talk about emotions, which was exactly my point. So sadly, I had to sort of, cut my losses and just submit for the masters and accept, okay, this is too much at this time. If I did it in 5 years, it might be more PhD fodder. So that was interesting then, but come back now, and because I think there's more openness and transparency and communication, because this is what we've had to do in a remote environment, I've seen a lot more compassion, and both self-compassion. So it might be, actually, boss, I'm looking after my elderly dad here. I need to get some respite care in today. I need to take this afternoon off. Mm-hmm. I'm hearing a lot more examples of, sure, this is part of your work-life balance. That's really important. And if you're working from home, you have a home life as well. So I think people are able to say, I need to be self-compassionate to myself. I have different needs and wants, but I'm also seeing compassionate leadership where managers and bosses are saying, yeah, I'm in the same boat with you. I've got an elderly mom. I'm in the same situation. So people are being open with their situation, but I think they're being more empathic. So soft skills, which ultimately are the bedrock of emotional intelligence, are coming out. I think people as well on an emotional intelligence level are more emotional. They are saying when they're upset, they are saying when they're stressed, they are saying when they're happy, frustrated. So ironically, we're going through a bit of an emotional intelligence era, which has really been forced upon us by the pandemic. So yeah, I'm seeing self-compassion, I'm seeing greater empathy, I'm seeing compassionate leadership as well. And I have faith that this will continue beyond, even when we're more working in the organization. But I think there's still going to be a lot of working from home. So I think we're still going to have the aftermath of the pandemic whenever it ends. I think it's always going to be about managing it rather than ending it. So I think, and I hope, we are in for a more empathic, more compassionate way of working in the workplace. That's my hope.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. This has just been an absolutely fantastic conversation, Rick, and I think, yes, hopefully one of many. It's been really wonderful to get this first insight into the work that you've done and hear about some of the books that you've published. Patricia, anything else to close with?
I mean, Rick is just full of really, really useful information, and certainly I would want to go more deep dive into, I know two things that have sprung out for me is the emotional intelligence and actually what's happening now, because I see it too, that there's a real need to be able to handle big emotions. And that area fascinates me. And then another one I know that you're busy with is well-being and resilience, which I know Laura is a very, she's absolutely keen on this subject as well. So I hope that we're going to be able to get into those topics a little bit more. But I mean, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you, Rick.
Yeah, great, likewise, and it's been great to speak with you both. And I like how we've sort of talked about a range of different issues, but I think it's been interesting how everything does link up in one way. There's a huge amount of stuff in there, but it does all connect up. So I also applaud the work that the two of you are doing in your areas as well. So it's been a good opportunity to catch up and meet you both.
Thanks, Rick. We'll put links to where people can find you when we post this on our channel, but is there anything else you want to plug before we close off? Anything else you're working on now?
Oh, if I must. Well, my latest book was Get a Life, Creating a Successful Work-Life Balance. And I won't say too much about that, that's maybe for another conversation, but only to say that books have a long publication lead time, and mine was, I think, the 3rd of March 2020, which, if you remember, was about 3 weeks before the UK went into the first lockdown. So I thought this was an absolute disaster. I spent a long time working on the book, not the best time to launch the book. But, and this is the big but, and this is maybe for next time, work-life balance has become such a huge issue for us all in the pandemic, and I think it will from here on. So that's my final plug. Thanks for the opportunity for that, but also for speaking with you both as well.
Yeah, more to come. Thank you both.
Thank you.